Mullen's Los Angeles is clearly another version of such a human-made biome. Robinson, it's true, tends to emphasize human design, whereas Mullen emphasizes coincidence and the complementary agencies of plants, animals, soil, and weather in the way anthropogenic biomes function. But both of these authors coincide in their goal to understand city and nature as elements of the same transformation processes. Both authors centrally aim to portray the constantly renewed processes of terraforming that create nature in and out of cities and cities as part of nature, and the processes that create and undo cultural and political communities at the same time. So both Robinson and Mullen remodel existing literary forms to express their new sense of the urban. Robinson's use of high modernist techniques of the urban novel, parallax, stream of consciousness, fragments of multiple discourses, images, juxtapositions, in combination with techniques of epic, so large-scale narration, enumerations, and so forth, contrasts at first sight with Mullen's minimalist redeployment of a very short verse form imported from a non-Western tradition. But both coincide in juxtaposing fragments and use the trope of the urban stroll to tie them together, ultimately to connect the urban flaneur to the ex-urban hiker so as to superimpose literary templates for portraying the experience of nature with the experience of the city. And both, as I've shown, go one step beyond by turning nature and the city themselves into strollers, not a setting in which only humans move, but other habitants, as they're called in actor network theory, also. And ultimately, this technique also correlates to their vision of urban communities, in which wide varieties of humans, as well as non-humans, make their presence felt, their voices heard, and their sights seen. In both, a first step toward more than human democracy that turns the idea of the Anthropocene away from its uniquely human focus. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. What, 15 minutes? Tom.
Yeah, we just passed 100th anniversary, 100-year anniversary of the death of the last constitution.
Right, okay.
And so I'm thinking that species extinction has become another one of those exceptions that we now accept as kind of the new norm. And assuming that mass extinction is a bad thing, what do you see the role of the environmental humanities in snapping humankind out of some just blind acceptance of that new norm, if you will?
Well,
or do you see that as your role at all?
how much time do we have? I just finished a book on that topic, so I could go on for quite a while. That is the topic of the book that I just finished, which tries to engage with current discourses about endangered species and biodiversity. And so, to me, sort of to sum it up very quickly, so we can, we're not here forever. So I think for me, what's most striking and most important about these discourses about extinction and endangered species is to understand, on one hand, the role that science has played in it, but also how the many uncertainties of the science about this, and how when these stories get social resonance, it is because they get tied to the stories that communities tell about their history, their origins, and their future. And that's certainly true of Martha. I mean, the passenger pigeon is one of the most written about species in the American literature of nature. I mean, there's I think something like 24 book-length explorations. One just came out last January. Joel Greenleaf's what is it called? A feathered river across the sky. The passenger pigeon's flight to extinction. And the passenger pigeon, like no other species. I mean, there are other species that also have been more in a similar way, like, the bison at the end of the 19th century, more recently, the ivory-billed woodpecker, wouldn't get that attention if it were not tied in with America's self-perception as nature's nation. And the whole story that in almost every book about the passenger pigeon gets rehearsed about how we were nature's nation and stopped being it when Martha died, right? I mean, that is sort of, in a much simplified, but that's a little bit the gist. And that's why that story in particular has had a resonance that other species have not had. Now, from a scientific viewpoint, you might say, is this a good thing? You know, we focus on a very, very select set of species at the expense of others. They're almost always animals, not plants, which are equally affected. They're almost always mammals or birds, rarely amphibians, reptiles, or fish, let alone anything in other taxa. You know, and I think conservationists have very mixed feelings about that, because on one hand you need to, these sort of emblematic species, the so-called charismatic megafauna or whatever, are very effective in sort of raising awareness and funding for conservation issues. On the other hand, they often block ecosystem functioning and biodiversity as a whole from view. I think, you know, from sort of humanity's viewpoint, to me what was the interesting thing to explore is, so what are these stories that in different communities and different countries get tied onto the tail, so to speak, of endangered species, and what can, by studying these kinds of stories, and they're stories that are not just told in text, they're stories that are told in film, in music, in paintings, in photography. I mean, photography is probably the single most important medium for talking about endangered species. By understanding what the stories are, what other non-biological things are being mourned and yearned for in these stories, I think we stand a lot to learn about which kind of stories might then be turned around to help foster conservation. So on one hand, my conclusion at the end was somewhat nihilistic, which is that however much people as individuals might be altruistic and care about non-human nature, to the extent that we care about it collectively, it's always because it gets tied to some human story and some human concern. But the upside of that is that I think if we understand that better, we can start to move away from the fallacy that I think that conservation scientists often fall into, that we think by just feeding the public more facts, we're going to turn people around. I think that's not the point. The facts are out there, you know, for anybody who wants to research them. I mean, there's gazillions of books. I mean, you know, there's a recent book on the passenger pigeon. There's Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, which just came out. Yeah, I mean, there's dozens, hundreds of books now about this. So the question is, you know, can we look at these stories and then come up with other stories that also, you know, take into account what the human concerns are? So that would be sort of a maybe preliminary answer to the question of what environmental humanities can do in that respect, or specifically in this case, literary analysis. I think philosophy and environmental history have other contributions to that discussion.
So for so long, there's been sort of like this idea of nature versus nurture, and I wonder how an Anthropocene sort of perspective, and like in large part the talk you just gave on illustrating the deviation of, or the rearticulation of nature into sort of these man-made societies, how you think that might play in sort of that dichotomy, that tension.
So I think what emerges from the general discussions about the Anthropocene is, you know, I mean, if you don't want to go with either the apocalyptic discourse or the sort of, to my mind, somewhat simplistically upbeat discourse. But I think what does emerge is that a lot of what we do with the planet from here on out is going to be up to, it's not going to be about going back to an older state of nature, right? That's been one of the main tropes that environmental discourse has used in the past, and that's no longer going to work in many, I mean, in some contexts it may still work, many it won't for practical reasons, because, you know, because of climate change. You're not going to be able to go back to the same vegetation and the same animals that you had in place 100 or 200 years ago. So the consensus that seems to emerge from that is that, okay, so we have to think about what kind of nature do we want? You know, what makes sense ecologically, and what can we agree on that we want in a particular community that inhabits a particular region. And that, I don't know if that's nurture particularly, but that's where sort of democratic decision-making comes in. And that's something that I think environmentalism needs to think about a lot more carefully, and that's really difficult. So how do we sort of bring together scientific insights and what people want, and how do we involve all kinds of different communities and stakeholders into the discussion of what we want to do in the face of rising sea levels, in the face of increased storms or increased drought or whatever the changes might be in each community. And so I think where the nurture part comes in is in thinking about what the kinds of procedures might be that get us going to thinking about this and shaping people from early on in their education to think about these issues and be conversant with what the science is, but also with what the cultural dimensions of it is. And there again, just to give an example, sort of from my hometown. So I last year started working on designing a project with some biological scientists on biodiversity in Los Angeles, where we wanted to do sort of a survey of what species are there in Los Angeles, which has never been done, and it's not been done for most major cities. I think it's been done for any major city. What we have is sort of surveys of birds or reptiles in particular cities, but urban biodiversity has not been much explored, and then to combine that with sets of interviews and conversations with different geographical, age, ethnic, and language communities. I mean, a place like LA, this has to be multilingual. It has to, it's almost, we're at 49% Hispanic, it's going to be a majority Hispanic population in another couple of years. So you have to cast your net really wide to talk to different communities about what biodiversity there is, but also what they want to see. So give a couple of concrete examples. There's a lot of projects around the rehabilitation of the LA River. And some people are now talking about reintroducing native turtle and snake and frog species. And so, one thing we were talking about is, okay, but we need to talk about with the people in the communities who live along the river, many of which are quite poor communities. I mean, the LA River, as you know, is a sort of concrete-lined canal in some sense, and it has to be up to a point because it's a western river that floods often and can cause catastrophic floods and has caused catastrophic floods in the past. So you can't just rip out all the concrete, but you can make it more ecologically functional, and you can make it more usable for humans. So you have to talk to the people who live along that river now and see whether they actually want these animals. And I can predict to you that the turtles and the frogs are not going to be a problem, but the snakes will be. Because most people don't, whether that's rational or not, it's not the question. Most people don't want their kids playing around snakes or snakes playing around their kids, And so there's no point in trying to reintroduce snakes if they're just going to be killed, right? So that kind of thing. And then, in LA, you have, of course, it's a hugely biodiverse city. But 90% of it is introduced species. Some of them perfectly harmless and some of them not so. And so to talk about that, what plants do we want here? Most of the iconic palm trees in LA are going to die within the next 10 or 20 years because palm trees have about a 70-year, 80-year lifespan. And most of the overwhelming majority of them were planted in the 1930s for the Olympic Games then. So they're nearing the end of their lifespan. And so there's now a discussion about what should they be replaced with. And so there's the cultural element of LA is just the city of palm trees, but all but one species are non-natives, and a lot of people actually, including the current mayor, are not so thrilled about having them back because they actually don't give a whole lot of shade. There's other trees that will be better suited, and there's a lot of conservationists now who'd rather plant sycamores and oaks, which are the native trees. So combining, on one hand the science, and on the other hand, what species are actually important to the cultural communities in the city? What biodiversity do they want to see? Which ones not? Now, whether that's going to add up to anything that's ecologically functional, we'll see. It might not, and in that case, do we blow democracy in the wind? What do? We'll have to face that when we come up to it. But I think those are the really crucial questions. The thing that I was really struck by when we talked to the scientists, And this is sort of where then my humanist bias sort of comes in, and my interest in hybridity and ambiguity and all that. So we're talking about, okay, so how do you actually go about counting species in LA, right? You're not going to go around and count every insect and every lizard and every bird, right? You can't do that in every tree and every plant. So how do we do this? And so at that point, the biologists sort of started talking among themselves, and they said, well, okay, so we have a pretty good insect survey, a pretty good tree survey, and we can do mammals and we can do birds without a problem, but fish, let's not even bother, they're all non-natives anyway. At that point, sort of, the humanists said, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? We want to find out what's here. And so we're not just going to count native stuff. That makes absolutely no sense in a place like LA. I mean, the first step, let's be scientific. Let's count everything that's there, and then we're going to decide what we want here and what we don't want here. You know, it may well turn out that we want a lot of the non-native fish to get out of there, you know, but that's a second step. But there was a sort of, I mean, that's where the nurture part, I think, really comes in. I mean, biologists are still really, really trained to think biodiversity means only native species, and any non-native diversity is undesirable. That's, you know, that's one way of thinking about it. In a place like LA, I think that's a dead-end way of thinking about it. So that's where sort of the retraining and re-education of how we think about this stuff, taking the science into account, of course, you know, but thinking about how can we merge what we want with what works ecologically and what works for other species, not just us. That's where the two come together. I'm sorry, this is a super lengthy answer to a simple question.
So sort of on that topic, I am very interested in Chernobyl and, well, I mean, not only the events prior to the ghost counting of it, but other ghost towns like it where there's no human population, but specifically Chernobyl because humans are typically not allowed in. I know that there's been a great change in the biodiversity. There's a lot more animals coming back to Chernobyl and doing amazingly well despite the buildings and such that were left behind. But going off that, do you think that it's possible to bring back nature while still coexisting with it? Or do you think that we need to sort of start all over and get rid of the buildings in order for nature to come back?
So I don't think nature has gone away. You know, I mean, that's exactly sort of the kind of thinking that I'm trying to change in myself. Nature is all over LA, and everybody in LA and in Lincoln has a relationship to nature. And so it's just thinking about it in a different way, and not just looking, oh, it's the rivers and the parks and everything else is not nature. Well, the stone, the materials that buildings are made out of are also nature. Now, it's a different nature, and we experience it differently, and that difference is very important. But I think that thinking that it's only when humans are not there that it's nature is precisely what I think is we need to move away from. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain kinds of nature from the past that we want to bring back. And I mean, in LA now, there's a major, in view of our drought, you know, there's a major move to bring back a lot of the drought-resistant plants and get rid of the water-sucking tropical plants that so many people love to have in their gardens. And, you know, LA is paying people $3 a foot to get rid of lawn, you know, and plant native plants instead, which tend to be quite drought-resistant, at least when they've been in the ground for a while. So there's certain kinds of nature that we certainly want to bring back. But, you know, yeah, Chernobyl, that's one example, so is the demilitarized zone. You can, you know, bring a certain kind of nature back by taking humans out. But then when you think about highly inhabited, I mean, yeah, California is just what, I'm sorry, I keep coming back to this, but just because I have to figure it out at the top of my head. I mean, plant biodiversity has actually gone up 15 to 20% in California over the 20th century. So biodiversity is huge. It's actually increased in a lot of local places. Where we're losing it is at the global level. And so to negotiate that, I think, is the challenge. I mean, we have hugely diverse urban environments. Not all of that diversity, however, can sustain itself over the long run, and some of it is detrimental to other kinds of diversity that we may want to preserve. At a global level, even if, you know, locally that may be challenging, but we may want to reserve some room for it. So I think it's not so much nature bringing back as about thinking, and for me, nature anyway is too abstract. I like to think about other species and about multi-species communities. So how can we make cities and spaces that are inhabited by humans and by lots of humans and by very techno-infested humans, how can we make those spaces that other species, lots of other species can inhabit with us? And there are a bunch of things that we can do to make that happen. And in a lot of cases, increasing native plants can hugely bring in, other kinds of species that you otherwise keep away. Getting rid of feral cats can be a way of bringing them back. Thinking about, so cats right now are the biggest danger to birds in the United States. Second biggest danger is windows. And as we've recently learned, not just the windows on high-rises, but there's actually millions of birds that get killed just flying into just big, patio doors or windows that we have. So, and there are now people working on solutions on, films that you can put over the windows that are invisible to us, but visible to birds, which have very differently structured eyes. And so pursuing these solutions, thinking about when you, and with the Urban Humanities Initiative at UCLA, we're actually thinking about developing a model multi-species dwelling for an exhibit next year. That would be really exciting, and I'm going to sort of push the bird perspective there. It's like, what can we, and the bug perspective, what can we do to make buildings actually more livable, more hospitable for these other species, right? So it's not so much, it's part bringing back, but then part also creating nature. But, in a place like LA also, so I was just telling the story on the way back from the prairie visit this morning. So I have living with me two pet birds, green-cheeked Amazons, that came to me, as adoptive birds, but I researched the history of the species. They're native to northeastern Mexico and are endangered in their natural habitat there because of the pet trade. And there's about 4,000 or 5,000 of them left there. There's three actually, big feral populations in the U.S. One in Florida, escaped pet birds. One in Brownsville, Texas, which may be a population that's migrated up the Rio Grande. And a huge one in the San Gabriel Valley of LA, where they've become so numerous that there's now 8,000 of them, which is more than in the original habitat. They're thriving. And so around the turn of the millennium, the California Bird Records Commission actually decided to make them California birds. As I said, introduced species, not native, of course, but to say, these belong here now. We should be happy that an endangered species has actually found a home here. Our city has become a sanctuary for an endangered species without our even intending it. So these things also happen, and we need to look at them. And I think that's, and everybody, of course, we have lots of other parrot species ferally around LA too, all of which are non-native. And even my biologist friends always break down at those. They say, oh, but the parrots are pretty cool to have around. So I think there's we'll be deciding which kinds of biodiversity do we want around. We may well decide that the parrots are here to stay, because if we get rid of them like we want to get rid of some of the cats, then, we actually don't do a service to the species because it doesn't look like it has a very bright future in its original habitat. So thinking about these things, I think, is really encouraging, and it also opens up one's eyes to the ways in which really unusual places can become sanctuaries and havens of biodiversity. And thinking about that, I think, is really exciting. What can we do in terms of building structure, in terms of traffic planning, in terms of green spaces, blue spaces? What can we do with these empty lots? So, most big cities have this enormous amount of empty lots. That's much bigger than the parks, much bigger than the blue spaces. So there are now people doing work on that. What can we do with that, given that they're privately owned, so it's a little bit tricky, but there's a huge potential there in terms of the space that they make up. So there's all kinds of interesting possibilities, I think, once you tune your mind to that, where you bring some nature back, but then you also bring some nature newly in.
Well, maybe we can have the discussion after or outside, because we have to get out of here by 7 o'clock. So I'm sure that Ursula is willing to talk a little bit. So thank you so much.